Hey, welcome back. Now, we've already created a nebula hazard and animated the nebula, but our game would be pretty boring if we only had a single hazard to avoid. So we want to think about multiple nebula hazards. In this video, we're going to create the variables we need to get a second hazard. This means we need a rectangle and a vector 2, as well as the animation frame integer, a running time float, and that update time variable that tells us how long to wait until we update our animation frame. Now, this is going to involve writing some repetitive code. In other words, we're copying what we did for the first nebula. And in programming, this is typically considered inefficient. So while we're doing it this way, we're going to be thinking about the possibility of a better solution to copying all this code. Let's dive right in. So here we are in dasher.cpp, and here are the nebula variables. Now we've already loaded a nebula texture, but since we want to draw this texture multiple times, we're going to need different rectangles and vector 2's for each nebula. So just below our nebrec and nebpos variables, let's create a couple more variables. Let's create a new rectangle for the second nebula. I'm going to call this neb2rec. Now we're going to initialize neb2rec. Now this can start off with the same values that nebrec starts off with, so let's go ahead and copy the values we initialized nebrec with and paste those in to initialize neb2rec. Now we also need a vector 2, and we can call this neb2pos. Now for this, we need to choose where we want the second nebula to start off. Now for the x, we started the first nebula off just past the right edge of the screen. Now we don't want the second nebula in the same location. We can start off the second nebula a little farther to the right. So let's use window width plus, say, 300. Now for the height, we can use the same value. So we're going to copy the second value, window height minus nebrec.height, and we're going to paste that in for the neb2pos y component. Now, just below this, we have the nebula animation variables, which it looks like I misspelled nebula here. We can go ahead and fix that. Now we need the neb frame, the neb update time, and the neb running time for the second nebula. So let's create those. I'm going to say int neb2frame. So we have the second nebula's animation frame variable. And we can create a const float neb2 update time. And if we want the second nebula to have a different update time, say 1.0 divided by 16.0, then the second nebula will cycle through the animations a bit faster. And of course, we need a float for the second nebula's running time, which we'll call neb2 running time. Now, we don't want nebulas to pass each other, so we're going to use the same velocity for all the nebulas. So I'm not going to create a velocity for the second nebula. So now that we have variables for the second nebula, we need to draw that rectangle. So let's scroll down to where we're calling draw texture rec and draw the second nebula. We'll add a comment here and say draw the second nebula. And we're going to use draw texture rec. And we'll use the same texture, nebula, but for the rectangle, we're going to use neb2rec. And for the position, we're going to use neb2pos. Now this is a different nebula, and if we want, we can tint this nebula with a color. I'm going to use red to see what it looks like when we tint a texture with red. Now we're drawing the texture, but we also need to update the animation frame for the second nebula. So let's scroll up slightly, and here we have the code for updating the nebula animation frame. We need to do all of this again for the second nebula. So I'm going to copy this code and paste it just underneath. Now instead of neb running time, we're going to use neb2 running time, And in our if statement conditional, we're going to check neb2 running time and see if it's greater than neb2 update time. If so, we need to set neb2 running time back to 0. And then we need to assign a value to neb2rec.x. And for this, instead of nebframe, we have to use neb2frame. And instead of nebrec.width, we have to use neb2rec.width. And then we have to update neb2frame and check if neb2frame is greater than 7, and if so, set neb2frame back to 0. So we're updating the animation frame, but we also need to move the second nebula using the velocity. Let's scroll up to where we're updating the nebula position, and let's update the second nebula's position. We'll add a comment that says, update the second nebula's position, and we're going to take that neb2pos.x and add nebval. And just like with our first nebula, we have to multiply by delta time, so we have frame rate independent movement. Okay, let's go to run and start debugging. So there's our first nebula, and there's our second one, which is tinted red. Beautiful. Okay, so in summary, we created a second nebula, which means we created all of those variables that we needed to draw the nebula to the screen and update its animation frame. This means we copied lots of code, an action that is typically very error-prone and not recommended. And I told you to keep in mind that there must be a better solution to copying and pasting all these lines of code. In the next video, we're going to talk about how we can create our own custom data types, like those special types, the rectangle and the vector 2. And we're going to use our own custom data type to avoid copying and pasting so much code. I'll see you in the next video.